Side 3. The children were to be kept in as a punishment for the misfortunes of the day before. Martha certainly hated having to punish the children quite as much as they hated to be punished. For one thing, she knew what a noise there would be in the house all day. And she had other reasons. "I declare," she said to the cook, "it seems almost a shame keeping them indoors this lovely day. But they are that audacious, they'll be walking in with their heads knocked off some of these days if I don't put my foot down. You make them a cake for tea tomorrow, dear, and we'll have baby along of us soon as we've got a bit forward with our work." So all the others were kept in, but Robert was allowed to go out for half an hour to get something they all wanted. And that, of course, was the day's wish. He had no difficulty in finding the sand fairy, for the day was already so hot that it had actually, for the first time, come out of its own accord, and it was sitting in a sort of pool of soft sand, stretching itself and trimming its whiskers and turning its snail's eyes round and round. "Ha!" it said, when its left eye saw Robert. "I've been looking out for you. Where are the rest of you? Not smashed themselves up with those wings, I hope?" "No," said Robert, "but the wings got us into a row, just as all the wishes do. So the others are kept indoors, and I was only let out for half an hour to get the wish. So please, let me wish as quickly as I can." "Wish away," said the Psammead. But Robert couldn't wish away. He forgot all the things he had been thinking about, and nothing would come into his head but little things for himself like toffee, a foreign stamp album, or a clasp knife with 3 blades and a corkscrew. "Well," said the Psammead at last, "you'd better hurry up with that wish of yours. Time flies." "I know it does," said Robert. "I can't think what to wish for. I wish you could give one of the others their wish without their having to come here to ask for it." "Oh, don't!" But it was too late. The Psammead had blown itself out to about 3 times its proper size, and now it collapsed like a pricked bubble, and with a deep sigh leaned back against the edge of its sand pool, quite faint with the effort. "There," it said in a weak voice. "It was tremendously hard, but I did it. Run along home, or they're sure to wish for something silly before you get there." They were, quite sure. Robert felt this. And as he ran home, his mind was deeply occupied with the sort of wishes he might find they had wished in his absence. He was running as fast as he could, but when he turned the corner that ought to have brought him within sight of the house, he opened his eyes so wide that he had to drop into a walk, for you cannot run with your eyes wide open. Then suddenly he stopped short, for there was no house to be seen. The front garden railings were gone too, and where the house had stood, Robert rubbed his eyes and looked again. Yes, the others had wished. There was no doubt about that. And they must have wished that they lived in a castle. For there the castle stood, black and stately, and very tall and broad, with battlements and lancet windows, and 8 great towers. And where the garden and the orchard had been, there were white things dotted like mushrooms. Robert walked slowly on, and as he got nearer, he saw that these were tents, and men in armour were walking about among the tents, crowds and crowds of them. "Oh, crikey," said Robert fervently. "They have. They've wished for a castle and it's being besieged. It's just like that sand fairy. I wish we'd never seen the beastly thing." At the little window above the great gateway, across the moat that now lay where the garden had been but half an hour ago, someone was waving something pale, dust-coloured. Robert thought it was one of Cyril's handkerchiefs. Robert waved back, and immediately felt that he had been unwise, for his signal had been seen by the besieging force, and 2 men in steel caps came running towards him. They had high brown boots on their long legs, and they came towards him with great strides. "By my halidom," said one as they approached, "a brave varlet this." Robert felt pleased at being called brave, and somehow it made him feel brave. "His garb is strange," said the other. "Some outlandish treachery belike. Say, lad, what brings thee hither?" "If you please, I want to go home," Robert said. "Go then. said the man in the longest boots. "None hindereth, and naught lets us to follow." "Where dwellest thou, young knave?" inquired the man with the largest steel cap. "Over there," said Robert, and directly he had said it, he knew he ought to have said, "Yonder." "Huh? Sayest so?" rejoined the longest boots. "Come hither, boy. This is a matter for our leader." And to the leader Robert was dragged forthwith by the reluctant ear. The leader was the most glorious creature Robert had ever seen. He had armour and a helmet and a horse and a crest and feathers and a shield and a lance and a sword. The whole appearance of the camp, army and leader might have been a shock to some, but Robert was dumb with admiration. "Come hither, lad," said the glorious leader. "Have no fear. Unfold thy tale without alarm," said the leader kindly. "Whence comest thou, and what seekest thou to accomplish? What is thine errand, that thou wanderest here alone among these rough men at arms? Poor child, thy mother's heart aches for thee e'en now, I'll warrant me. Fear not to speak the truth, my child. Thou hast naught to fear from Wulfric de Talbot." Robert began boldly enough by saying, "Gramercy for thy courtesy, fair Sir Knight. The fact is, it's like this, and I hope you're not in a hurry because the story's rather a breather. Father and Mother are away, and when we were down playing in the sandpit, we found a Samiad." "I cry thee mercy. A Samiad?" said the knight. "Yes, a sort of fairy or enchanter. Yes, that's it, an enchanter. And he said we could have a wish every day." "He is an enchanter of might?" "Oh, yes, of might and main, rather." "And thou deemest that it is the spells of the enchanter that thou hast angered, that have lent strength to the besieging party," said the gallant leader. "But know thou that Wulfric de Talbot needs no enchanter's aid to lead his followers to victory." "Oh, no, I'm sure you don't," said Robert with hasty courtesy. "But all the same, it's partly his fault, but we're most to blame. You couldn't have done anything if it hadn't been for us." "How now, bold boy?" asked Sir Wulfric haughtily. "Thy speech is dark, and eke scarce courteous. Unravel me this riddle." "Oh," said Robert desperately, "of course you don't know it, but you're not real at all. You're only here because the others must have been idiots enough to wish for a castle, and when the sun sets you'll just vanish away and it'll be all right." The captain and the men-at-arms exchanged glances, at first pitying and then sterner, as the longest-booted man said, "Beware, noble my lord. The urchin doth but feign madness to escape from our clutches. Shall we not bind him?" "I'm no more mad than you are," said Robert angrily. "Perhaps not so much, only I was an idiot to think you'd understand anything. Let me go, I haven't done anything to you." "Whither?" asked the knight. "Whither wouldst thou wend?" "Home, of course." Robert pointed to the castle. "To carry news of succour?" "Nay." "All right then," said Robert, struck by a sudden idea. "Then let me go somewhere else." "So go where thou wilt, thou art free. Wulfric de Talbot warreth not with babes, and Jakin here shall bear thee company." "All right," said Robert wildly. "Jakin will enjoy himself, I think. Come on, Jakin. Sir Wulfric, I salute thee." He saluted after the modern military manner, and set off running to the sandpit, Jakin's long boots keeping up easily. He found the fairy. He dug it up, he woke it up, he implored it to give him one more wish.
"I've done 2 today already," he grumbled, "and one was as stiff a bit of work as ever I did."
"Oh, do, said Robert.
"Well, what is it?" snapped the Samiad with cross sleepiness.
"I wish I was with the others," said Robert. And the Samiad began to swell. Robert never thought of wishing the castle and the siege away. Of course, he knew they had all come out of a wish, but swords and daggers and pikes and lances seemed much too real to be wished away. Robert lost consciousness for an instant. When he opened his eyes, The others were crowding around him. "We never heard you come in," they said. "How awfully jolly of you to wish it to give us our wish. Of course we understood that was what you'd done. But you ought to have told us. Suppose we'd wished something silly." "Silly," said Robert, very crossly indeed. "How much sillier could you have been, I'd like to know? You nearly settled me, I can tell you." Then he told his story, and the others admitted that it certainly had been rough on him. "We haven't done anything yet," said Anthea comfortably. "We've waited for you. We're going to shoot at them through these little loopholes with the bows and arrows Uncle gave you, and you shall have the first shot as captain of the besieged force." "I don't think I would," said Robert cautiously. "You don't know what they're like near to. They've got real bows and arrows, an awful length, and swords and pikes and daggers and all sorts of sharp things. Look here, have you explored the castle? Because I think we'd better let them alone as long as they let us alone. I heard that Jakin man said that they weren't going to attack till just before sundown." The room was square. A low door at the corner led to a flight of steps, up and down. The children went down. They found themselves in a great arched gatehouse. The enormous doors were shut and barred. There was a window in a little room at the bottom of the round turret up which the stair wound, rather larger than the other windows, and looking through it, they saw the drawbridge was up and the portcullis down. The moat looked very wide and deep. Opposite the great door that led to the moat was another great door with a little door in it. The children went through this and found themselves in a big paved courtyard with the great grey walls of the castle rising dark and heavy on all four sides. Near the middle of the courtyard stood Martha, moving her right hand backwards and forwards in the air. The cook was stooping down and moving her hands, also in a very curious way. But the oddest, and at the same time most terrible thing, was the lamb, who was sitting on nothing, about 3 feet from the ground, laughing happily. The children ran towards him. Just as Anthea was reaching out her arms to take him, Martha said crossly, "Let him alone, do, miss, when he is good." "But what is he doing?" said Anthea. "Doing? Why, he's sitting in his high chair as good as gold, a precious, watching me doing the ironing. Get along with you, do. My iron's cold again." She went towards the cook and seemed to poke an invisible fire with an unseen poker. The cook seemed to be putting an unseen dish into an invisible oven. "Run along with you, do," she said. "I'm behindhand as it is. You won't get no dinner if you come a-hindering of me like this. Come, off you goes, or I'll pin a dishcloth to some of your tails." The children went through the first doorway they came to and sat down helplessly on a wooden bench that ran along the room inside. "How awful," said Anthea and Jane together, and Jane added, "I feel as if I was in a mad asylum." "Oh, do dry up a sec," said Cyril. "I want to think." He buried his face in his hands, and the others looked about them. They were in a long room with an arched roof. There were wooden tables along it, and one across at the end of the room, on a sort of raised platform. The room was very dim and dark. The floor was strewn with dry things like sticks, and they did not smell nice. "Let's go on exploring," said Anthea. "Perhaps we might find something to eat." This lighted hope in every breast, and they went on exploring the castle, but neither food nor men-at-arms were to be found in it. Presently they saw Martha carrying an invisible tray across the courtyard, for it seemed that, by the most fortunate accident, the dining room of the house and the banqueting hall of the castle were in the same place. They waited in wretched silence while Martha went through the form of carving an unseen leg of mutton and serving invisible greens and potatoes with a spoon that no one could see. When she had left the room, the children looked at the empty table and then looked at each other. "This is worse than anything," said Robert. "I'm not so very hungry," said Anthea, trying to make the best of things. Cyril tightened his belt ostentatiously. Jane burst into tears. The children were sitting in the gloomy banqueting hall at the end of one of the long, bare wooden tables. There was now no hope. Martha had brought in the dinner, and the dinner was invisible and unfeelable too. Suddenly, Cyril felt in his pocket. "Right! Oh!" he cried. "Look here! Biscuits!" Rather broken and crumbled, certainly, but still biscuits. 3 whole ones and a generous handful of crumbs and fragments. "I got them this morning and I had quite forgotten," he explained, as he divided them with scrupulous fairness into 4 heaps. They were eaten in happy silence. Then Robert said, "Yes, but look here, Squirrel. You're so clever at explaining about invisibleness and all that. How is it the biscuits are here and all the bread and meat and things have disappeared?" "I don't know," said Cyril after a pause, "unless it's because we had them. Nothing about us has changed. Everything's in my pocket, all right." "Then, if we had the mutton, it would be real," said Robert. "Oh, don't I wish we could find it." "But we can't find it. I suppose it isn't ours till we've got it in our mouths. Or in our pockets," said Jane, thinking of the biscuits. "Who puts mutton in their pockets, goose girl?" said Cyril. "But I know at any rate. I'll try it." He leaned over the table with his face about an inch from it and kept opening and shutting his mouth as if he were taking bites out of air. "It's no good," said Robert in deep dejection. "You'll only—" "Hello!" Cyril stood up with a grin of triumph, holding a square piece of bread in his mouth. It was quite real. Everyone saw it. It is true that directly he bit a piece off, the rest vanished. But it was all right, because he knew he had it in his hand, though he could neither see nor feel it. He took another bite from the air between his fingers, and it turned into bread as he bit. The next moment, all the others were following his example and opening and shutting their mouths an inch or so from the bare-looking table. Robert captured a slice of mutton but I think I will draw a veil over the rest of this painful scene. The pudding was, fortunately, a plain suet roly-poly, and in answer to Martha's questions, the children, all with one accord, said that they would not have treacle on it, nor jam, nor sugar. "Just plain, please," they said. Martha said, "Well, I never. What next, I wonder?" and went away. Then ensued another scene on which I will not dwell, for nobody looks nice picking up slices of suet pudding from the table in its mouth like a dog. After dinner, Robert, as captain, insisted on climbing to the top of one of the towers to reconnoitre, so up they all went. And now they could see all round the castle, and could see, too, that beyond the moat, on every side, the tents of the besieging party were pitched. A large party came along the road, with horses dragging along the great trunk of a tree, and Cyril felt quite pale. "What a good thing we've got a moat," he said, "and what a good thing the drawbridge is up. I should never have known how to work it." "I think I'm glad it's only a game. It is only a game, isn't it?" said Jane. But no one answered. The children found plenty of strange weapons in the castle, and if they were armed at all, it was soon plain that they would be, as Cyril said, armed heavily. For these swords and lances and crossbows were far too weighty for Cyril's manly strength, and as for the longbows, none of the children could even begin to bend them. The daggers were better, but Jane hoped that the besiegers would not come close enough for daggers to be of any use. "Never mind, we can hurl them like javelins," said Cyril, "or drop them on people's heads. I say, there are a lot of stones on the other side of the courtyard. What if we took some of those up, just to drop them on their heads if they were trying to swim the moat?" So a heap of stones grew apace, up in the room above the gate, and another heap, a shiny, spiky, dangerous-looking heap, of daggers and knives. As Anthea was crossing the courtyard for more stones, a sudden and valuable idea came to her. She went to Martha and said, "May we just have biscuits for tea? We're going to play at besieged castles, and we'd like the biscuits to provision the garrison. Put mine in my pocket, please. My hands are so dirty, and I'll tell the others to fetch theirs." This was indeed a happy thought, for now, with 4 generous handfuls of air, which turned to biscuit as Martha crammed it into their pockets, the garrison was well provisioned till sundown. They brought up some iron pots of cold water to pour on the besiegers instead of hot lead, with which the castle did not seem to be provided. When it seemed to be tea time, the biscuits were eaten with water from the deep well in the courtyard, drunk out of horns. Cyril insisted on putting by 8 of the biscuits, in case anyone should feel faint in stress of battle. Just as he was putting away the reserve biscuits in a sort of little stone cupboard without a door, a sudden sound made him drop 3. It was the loud, fierce cry of a trumpet. "You see, it is real," said Robert, "and they're going to attack." All rushed to the narrow windows. "Yes," said Robert, "they're all coming out of their tents and moving about like ants. There's that Jakin dancing about where the bridge joins on. I wish he could see me put my tongue out at him. Nah." "Oh dear," said Jane. "I think Cyril was a perfect silly to wish for a castle, and I don't want to play." The scene was almost too pretty to be alarming. The trumpets were sounding, and when the trumpets stopped for breath, the children could hear the cling-clang of armour and the murmur of voices. A trumpeter came forward to the edge of the moat. Then a man shouted, "What ho! Within there!" "Hello there!" Robert bellowed back at once. "In the name of our Lord the King, and of our good Lord and trusty leader, Sir Wulfric de Talbot, we summon this castle to surrender, on pain of fire and sword and no quarter. Do ye surrender?" "No," bawled Robert. "Of course we don't. Never, never, never." The man answered back, "Then your fate be on your own heads." "Cheer," said Robert in a fierce whisper. "Cheer to show them that we aren't afraid, and rattle the daggers to make more noise. 1, 2, 3, hip, hip, hooray! Again. Hip, hip, hooray! One more. Hip, hip, hooray!" There was another shout from the camp across the moat, and then the beleaguered fortress felt that the attack had indeed begun. "The moat is dreadfully thin," said Anthea. "But they can't get into the castle even if they do swim over," said Robert. And as he spoke, he heard feet on the stair outside, heavy feet and the clank of steel. No one breathed for a minute. The steel and the feet went on up the turret stairs. Then Robert sprang softly to the door. He pulled off his shoes. "Wait here," he whispered, and stole quickly and softly after the boots and spur clank. He peeped into the upper room. The man was there, and it was Jakin, all dripping with moat water, and he was fiddling about with the machinery which Robert felt sure worked the drawbridge. Robert banged the door suddenly and turned the great key in the lock just as Jakin sprang to the inside of the door. Then he tore downstairs and into the little turret at the foot of the tower where the biggest window was. "We ought to have defended this," he cried to the others as they followed him. He was just in time. Another man had swum over, and his fingers were on the window ledge. Robert hit them as hard as he could with an iron bar that he caught up from the floor. The man fell with a plop-plash into the moat water. In another moment, Robert was outside the little room, had banged its door, and was shooting home the enormous bolts and calling to Cyril to lend a hand. Then they stood in the arched gatehouse, breathing hard and looking at each other. Jane's mouth was open. There was a creaking above, and something rattled and shook. The pavement they stood on seemed to tremble. Then a crash told them that the drawbridge had been lowered to its place. "That's the beast Jakin," said Robert. "There's still the portcullis. I'm almost certain that's worked from lower down." And now the drawbridge rang and echoed hollowly with the hoofs of horses and the tramp of armed men. "Up, quick!" cried Robert. "Let's drop things on them." The children followed Robert quickly, and under his direction began to drop stones out through the long, narrow windows. There was a confused noise below, and some groans. "Oh dear," said Anthea, putting down the stone she was just going to drop out. "I'm afraid we've hurt somebody." Robert caught up the stone in a fury. "I should just hope we had," he said. "I'd give something for a jolly good boiling kettle of lead. Surrender indeed." And now came the thundering thump of the battering ram, and the little room was almost quite dark. "We've held it," cried Robert. "We won't surrender. The sun must set in a minute. Here, they're all jawing underneath again. Pity there's no time to get more stones. Here, pour that water down on them. It's no good, of course, but they'll hate it." "Oh, dear," said Jane. "Don't you think we'd better surrender?" "Never," said Robert. "We'll have a parley if you like, but we'll never surrender. Oh, I'll be a soldier when I grow up. You just see if I don't. I won't go into the civil service, whatever anyone says." "Well, let's wave a handkerchief and ask for a parley," Jane pleaded. "I don't believe the sun's going to set tonight at all." "Give them the water first, the brutes," said the bloodthirsty Robert. So Anthea tilted the pot over the nearest lead hole and poured. They heard a splash below, but no one below seemed to have felt it, and again the ram battered the great door. Anthea paused. "How idiotic," said Robert, lying flat on the floor and putting an eye to the lead hole. "Of course, the holes go straight down into the gatehouse. That's for when the enemy has got past the door and the portcullis, and almost all is lost. Here, hand me the pot." He crawled onto the three-cornered window ledge in the middle of the wall, and taking the pot from Anthea, poured the water out through the arrow slit. And as he began to pour, the noise of the battering ram, and the trampling of the foe, and the shouts of "Surrender!" and "De Talbot forever!" all suddenly stopped, and went out like the snuff of a candle. The little dark room seemed to whirl round and turn topsy-turvy, and when the children came to themselves, there they were, safe and sound, in the big front bedroom of their own house, the house with the ornamental nightmare iron top to the roof. They all crowded to the window and looked out. The moat and the tents and the besieging force were all gone, and there was the garden, with its tangle of dahlias and marigolds and asters and late roses, and the spiky iron railings, and the quiet, white road. Everyone drew a deep breath. "And that's all right," said Robert. "I told you so." "Look here," said Anthea. "It's just come into my head. This is the very first thing we've wished for that hasn't got us into a row. And there hasn't been the least little scrap of a row about this. Nobody's raging downstairs. We're safe and sound. We've had an awfully jolly day. At least, not jolly exactly, but you know what I mean." The door was opened suddenly and fiercely. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves," said the voice of Martha. "I thought you couldn't last through the day without getting up to some doggery. A person can't take a breath of air on the front doorstep, but you must be emptying the wash-hand jug on their heads. Off you go to bed, the lot of you, and try to be better children in the morning." She flounced out, amid a disregarded chorus of regrets and apologies. The children were very sorry, but really it was not their faults. But they took themselves off to bed as quickly as they could. "Look here," said Cyril. "I've got an idea." "Silence for Squirrel's oration," said Robert. Cyril balanced himself on the edge of the water butt in the backyard, where they all happened to be, and spoke. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, and women, we found a Samiad. We have had wishes, but we haven't really got anything worth having for our wishes. Ladies and gentlemen, you know jolly well that when we're all rotting about in the usual way, heaps of things keep cropping up. And then real earnest wishes come into the heads of the beholder. Why, even Robert might happen to think of a really useful wish, if he didn't injure his poor little brains trying so hard to think. So let's just play bandits or forts or soldiers or any of the old games. We're dead sure to think of something if we try not to. You always do." The others consented. Bandits was hastily chosen for the game. The Lamb's mail cart was covered with a red and blue check tablecloth and made an admirable baggage wagon. The Lamb, asleep inside it, was not at all in the way. So the banditti set out along the road that led to the sandpit. "We ought to be near the Psammead," said Cyril, "in case we think of anything suddenly." The game was dragging a little, and some of the bandits were beginning to feel that the others were disagreeable things and were saying so candidly, when the baker's boy came along the road with loaves in a basket. The opportunity was not one to be lost. "Stand and deliver!" cried Cyril. "Your money or your life!" said Robert, and they stood on each side of the baker's boy. Unfortunately, he did not seem to enter into the spirit of the thing at all. He merely said, "Chuck it now, do you hear?" and pushed the bandits aside most disrespectfully. Then Robert lassoed him with Jane's skipping rope, and instead of going round his shoulders as Robert intended, it went round his feet and tripped him up. The basket was upset. The beautiful new loaves went bumping and bouncing all over the dusty chalk road. The girls ran to pick them up, and all in a moment, Robert and the baker's boy were fighting it out man to man with Cyril to see fair play. Robert was badly beaten. The baker's boy blacked his eye and pulled Robert's hair, then kicked him on the knee. Cyril was just tearing off his coat so as to help his brother in proper style, when Anthea rushed in between Robert and the baker's boy and caught that unfair and degraded fighter round the waist, imploring him not to fight any more. "Oh, don't hurt my brother any more," she said in floods of tears. "He didn't mean it. It's only play, and I'm sure he's very sorry." But the baker's boy pushed Anthea away very roughly and chased Robert with kicks and unpleasant conversation right down the road to the sandpit, and there, with one last kick, he landed him in a heap of sand. "I'll learn you, you young varmint," he said, and went off to pick up his loaves and go about his business. He went off red and damp about the face, abusive to the last. He called them a pack of silly idiots, and disappeared round the corner. It was not a happy party that flung itself down in the sand beside the sobbing Robert, for Robert was sobbing, mostly with rage. Then he dug his toes and his hands into the sand and wriggled in his anger. "Beast! I hate him! I only wish I was bigger than him, that's all!" Suddenly he sprang up, for his hand had touched something furry. It was the Psammead, of course. "On the lookout to make sillies of them as usual," as Cyril remarked later. And of course, the next moment, Robert's wish was granted. And he was bigger than the baker's boy. Oh, but much, much bigger. No one had a foot rule in its pocket, so Robert could not be measured. But he was taller than your father would be if he stood on your mother's head, which I am sure he would never be unkind enough to do. He must have been 10 or 11 feet high. The others could not help laughing. "The Psammead's done us again," said Cyril, laughing. "Oh, look here, Squirrel," said Anthea. "Let's play fair. It is hateful for poor old Bobs all alone up there. Let's ask the Psammead for another wish. And if it will, I do really think we ought to be made the same size." The others agreed, but not gaily. But when they found the Psammead, it wouldn't. "Not I," it said crossly, rubbing its face with its feet. "He's a rude, violent boy, and it'll do him good to be the wrong size for a bit. Go away and leave me in peace, do. I can't think why you don't wish for something sensible, something to eat or drink, or good manners or good tempers. Go along with you, do." The children turned again to the colossal Robert. "Whatever shall we do?" they said. And they all said it. "First," said Robert grimly, "I'm going to reason with that baker's boy. I shall catch him at the end of the road." And with this, he strode off. He crouched behind a haystack in the farmyard that is at the corner, and when he heard the boy come whistling along, he jumped out at him and caught him by the collar. "Now," he said, and his voice was about 4 times its usual size, "I'm going to teach you to kick boys smaller than you." He lifted up the baker's boy and set him on the top of the haystack, which was about 16 feet from the ground, and then he sat down on the roof of the cowshed and told the baker's boy exactly what he thought of him. Then he shook the boy and said, "And now get down the best way you can," and left him. I don't know how the baker's boy got down, but I do know that he missed the cart, and got into the very hottest of hot water when he turned up at last at the bakehouse. When Robert rejoined the others, he found them in the garden. Anthea had thoughtfully asked Martha to let them have dinner out there, because the dining room was rather small, and it would have been so awkward to have a brother the size of Robert in there. Martha brought out the dinner. It was cold veal and baked potatoes, with sago pudding and stewed plums to follow. She, of course, did not notice that Robert was anything but the usual size, and she gave him as much meat and potatoes as usual, and no more. Robert groaned and asked for more bread, but Martha would not go on giving more bread forever. She was in a hurry, because the keeper intended to call on his way to Benonhurst Fair, and she wished to be dressed smartly before he came. "I wish we were going to the fair," said Robert. "You can't go anywhere that size," said Cyril. "Why not?" said Robert. "They have giants at fairs, much bigger ones than me." "Not much they don't," Cyril was beginning, when Jane screamed, "Oh, I've had an idea. Let's take Robert to the fair and get them to give us money for showing him. Then we really shall get something out of the old Sammy-ad at last." And so it turned out. The idea appealed irresistibly to everyone but Robert, and even he was brought round by Anthea's suggestion that he should have a double share of any money they might make. There was a little old pony trap in the coach house. It seemed desirable to get to the fair as quickly as possible, so Robert, who could now take enormous steps and go so very fast indeed, consented to wheel the others in this. The lamb had developed a cold, which prevented his being of the party. Just outside Benonhurst, Robert hid in a barn, and the others went on to the fair. There were swings, and a hooting, tooting, blaring merry-go-round, and a shooting gallery and coconut shies. Cyril went up to the woman who was loading little guns before the array of glass bottles on strings against a sheet of canvas. "Here you are, little gentleman," she said. "Penny a shot." "No, thank you," said Cyril. "We are here on business, not on pleasure. Who's the master?" The woman pointed to a stout man in a dirty linen jacket who was sleeping in the sun. "It will be very profitable for him," Cyril went on. "I think he'll be sorry if we take it away." "Oh, if it's money in his pocket," said the woman. "No kid now. What is it?" "It's a giant." "Come along and see," said Anthea. Anthea led the way to the barn. "It really is a giant," she said. "He's a giant little boy. We thought perhaps you'd like to show him and get pennies. And if you'd like to pay us something, you can. Only it'll have to be rather a lot, because we promised him he would have a double share of whatever we made." The woman murmured something indistinct, and when they reached the barn, Cyril called, "Robert!" There was a stir among the loose hay, and Robert began to come out. His hand and arm came first, then a foot and leg. When the woman saw the hand, she said, "My!" And when she saw the foot, she said, "Upon my civvy!" And when the whole of Robert's enormous bulk was at last completely disclosed, she drew a long breath and said excitedly, "What'll you take for him?" "Anything in reason. We'd have a special van built. Leastways, I know where there's a second-hand one that would do up handsome. What a baby elephant had has died. What'll you take?" "They won't take anything," said Robert sternly. "I'll come and be a chauffeur today if you'll give me 15 shillings. "Done," said the woman, so quickly that Robert felt he had been unfair to himself and wished he had asked 30. End of side 3.